appreciate it. So tell us, tell us
Just
about you, Mr. Markos. You are an attorney. Your office is what, 1515?
1515
Market Street. Yep.
Suite 1300.
I walk all by there all the time. Never think to wave. Hey, you doing? Bring some donuts.
There are a lot of
coffee.
lawyers in that building.
Quite a bit, yes.
Yeah.
But not all of them have your distinguished history because I've done some checking.
Research.
Yes, and Mr. Markos, share with our readers a little bit of what I was able to find out, a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure. I went to law school right out of college. But in college, my last semester, I took a course called Famous Trials. It was a United States history elective, which was my minor. And it was a really, really interesting class because we kind of covered the 20th century through a lot of important legal cases, starting in like the early 20th century with criminal prosecutions of anarchists, going through like the Scopes monkey trial, the My Lai massacre, court martials, and that time period. And I kind of gleaned the sort of like common theme of like justice and injustice, and how there are a lot of lawyers in the world, but not a whole lot of them are doing the kind of work that can make a difference in the country and in people's lives. A lot of them just move money around. Not that there's anything wrong with making a living, but that extra aspect to it was very appealing to me, and it kind of drove my law school career in a lot of ways. So I went to law school right out of college. I think I did pretty well, and I ended up with a judge in North Jersey for a year, and then after that I worked for the ACLU in Pennsylvania for a year, which was a great experience because I learned how to be a lawyer, and it was a really great learning opportunity, but I also was really lucky to kind of like fall into exactly what I wanted to end up doing right out the bat. There I worked on a police misconduct project. I worked on a lot of other things, a case involving due process rights of people with a court cost assessment against them from a criminal case in their past, accurately or not. And then after that year, I've been at my current firm, which has changed names in the meantime, but I've been there ever since. And again, I got really lucky to be able to find a job to do the sort of thing I had set out to do, the civil rights practice. It's not the only area of law that I practice, but I only represent victims of one sort or another, people who need some vindication, and they come to us. And we try to help them.
Now, what was it about? And I like what you said about lawyers, because there are a whole bunch of, just like there's a whole bunch of jokes about politicians, so there are about lawyers and how money hungry they are. You chose to represent people. You chose to represent those things which advance the interests of society. Why do you think that was? What was it that made you gravitate towards issue-oriented cases?
Well, to the extent it's a personal thing. I mean, like I said, there's nothing wrong with making a living, and there's a lot of interesting academic aspects to many other areas of law that don't excite me. But there is something unique about civil rights especially, which is that your case is always bigger than your case because it has to do with constitutional rights. So the constitutional rights that are at issue in your case could come up again in somebody else's case. And I think it's important to be keeping the government and its agents accountable to the letter of the Constitution, to the spirit of the Constitution, and to make sure that there is an avenue that people who feel that they've been wronged to have that redress available to them and that vindication. And, academically for me, like the constitutional issues are very interesting. None of my friends like to talk to me about it because they don't find it interesting outside of my law firm. But I always found that very interesting and exciting work. So part of it is a personal preference, but to me, I needed something beyond like the day-to-day that motivated me to go to work, and that was it.
You were quoted as saying, and I have this right here on my phone. See, I did some research on you. I just want you to know. You were quoted as saying, I like being an advocate for my client and the Constitution at the same time. It's challenging personally and intellectually. Standing up for the rule of law is invigorating. Tell me what you meant by it's challenging personally and intellectually. In what ways?
Well, it's not easy. I mean, you read the Constitution, you think you know what it says. I do too. But when you get into the morass of all these legal doctrines, there's a lot of legal, um, I don't want to say ambiguity. It's a rigorous area of the law to practice. It's not more or less rigorous than anything else, but it's not unambiguous. And that's part of the challenging part. There are other challenges that go along with it too, because if I am representing a poor client from the city who has a claim against a police officer, and I have to bring the case in federal court for reasons we can talk about if you want to know, there is a challenge to that too, because the police officer is in a familiar place and they're in an unfamiliar place. And the jury pool for the federal court pulls not just from Philadelphia, but all the surrounding counties, including Chester County, Northampton, Berks County. So they're going to be unfamiliar to that jury pool too. So to be the sort of ambassador to them, there is a challenge to that, to get that person's story to relate to people that wouldn't usually be able to relate to that. And I think it's hard work because those cases are hard fought.
And you know, one thing about civil rights in the current administration and the Donald Trump administration, civil rights have has come once again to the forefront where it may have seemed to be less so in the 90s. As a civil rights attorney, have you found that, and I mean maybe not just the cases that you're dealing with, but among your colleagues as well who are civil rights litigants and advocates, are you finding an influx of new civil rights complaints since 45's inauguration?
I'm on a much more local level. So I personally haven't seen an uptick or a downtick. When you think about it, we're a little bit insulated from that in Philadelphia. Right. We have a Democratic city, a Democratic district attorney, a Democratic mayor, and it's been that way for a long time. Right. So a lot of that stuff hasn't really played out on our very local level. Likewise, you have a lot of resistance to a lot of Trump administration policies in Philadelphia by the city itself or various aspects of it, such as refusing to cooperate with ICE, the sanctuary city issue. There are others.
Now, I was going to ask you about that because you drafted a resolution which was which passed, which had it not, it would have made institutions of higher learning, colleges, etc. They would have had to comply with provide information about immigrant students. What could you tell me about that? Just tell our listeners.
Yeah, that was a resolution that I drafted for the Philadelphia Bar Association, which was approved by their governance board to be submitted to the legislature, which was considering legislation that would, like you said, require certain institutions of higher education to, well, there are a couple different versions of the bill at the time, but essentially like what you said, share information about immigrant students, cooperate with law enforcement investigations. If ICE knocks on the administration door, they would have to say, yes, please come in. The opposition to that legislation that I wrote about in the resolution was, first of all, most of these colleges are private places where they might be a state institution, but where the student lives is regarded as a matter of constitutional law as a private place. And you can't change that with the stroke of a pen by a legislature. Colleges should be a safe place for students. They don't have to look over their shoulder. They should be focusing on education and learning about whatever interests them and motivates them, and learning how to be an adult in a new community. and this idea that you're going to have, these witch hunts coming onto your campus and having to be concerned about that is obviously problematic. Likewise, it could easily be used as a tool to intimidate students of color, and that's another potential issue that we saw.
Right. And that answered my next question, because I was going to ask, how had that resolution not have been ratified, what impact do you think that would have had on colleges and institutions of higher learning?
Well, the idea of a sanctuary campus, honestly, was a new idea at the time, but it became a sort of buzzword when Trump was elected. Now, the resolution was just on behalf of the Bar Association, which has some credibility with the legislature, but it's a conservative legislature. It's always been in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
So I'd only be speculating to say if we hadn't passed that resolution, what would have happened next.
Sure. But now, how difficult, and like you said, a lot of people see Philadelphia is heavily Democratic, but Pennsylvania itself, outside of Philadelphia,
Not very far outside.
it's not very liberal. So how challenging was it to get that resolution passed and to prevent ICE and other immigration authorities from using colleges and institutions of higher learning to their ends?
Well, it wasn't very hard to pass. I mean, when we presented it to the board, there was pretty much unanimous support. The only feedback was really about grammar.
Okay.
Yeah. But there was a lot of support for the idea that let students be students. Just they have a right to be there. They're paying to be there. Their undocumented status doesn't necessarily mean they crossed the border illegally. It doesn't necessarily mean that the government is entitled, period, to send them somewhere else.
Was there any pushback whatsoever from anywhere?
Not that I saw. Not that I experienced.
Really?
No. Yeah.
That's impressive. Wow. You're restoring my faith in humanity. I would figure there'd be more, maybe because I've grown so cynical over the past couple of years. But what kind of cases are you working? I know you can't discuss, I guess, but
I can discuss as much as I can discuss. I can tell you a lot about the cases that I have, but if I file a complaint, what's in the complaint is public record.
Okay. So, what kind of cases are you working on now that our listeners might find interesting?
Well, I have a lot of different cases, and every case is unique. And I don't always work in Philadelphia either. So I have a case, and we represent a man named Benjamin Franklin. But he's from out in Harrisburg, and he was arrested on his doorstep for trespassing by a police officer.
On his doorstep?
On his doorstep.
Is he black?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I figured that.
He was arrested on his doorstep for trespassing. And when I say his doorstep, it's a house that he owns, but it's he's a developer. Like he builds and renovates houses. So it's one of his houses, but it's his house that he owns, and he got arrested and roughed up a little bit. So we filed a lawsuit under the Civil Rights statute because of the violation of his civil rights and the harms that it caused. I try to think about all of my cases. I can't think about. I can't think about any of them, but I have a little prompt, so let me cheat real quick.
Okay.
We like to,
and we do allow cheating here.
We do allow cheating. Just don't say it out loud.
We have a civil rights case on behalf of a prisoner. And that's a little bit of a different case because there is more of a lot of our civil rights cases. Well, let me go back a little bit. Civil rights litigation, as it is now, really started around 1961 with this Supreme Court case called Monroe versus Pape. And that was the case that sort of opened up the idea that this statute, 42 USC section 1983, allows you to bring a damages claim, a claim for money damages, for a violation of your constitutional rights. Before there was that statute, the idea was if your constitutional rights are in threat of being violated, you could file for an injunction, which is a court order that would stop something prospectively from happening. But if your rights had been violated and the risk had passed, then there was nothing you could do. This law changed that. The law was passed during Reconstruction, but it was kind of dormant for that 100-year period. So a lot of cases, I don't want to say garden variety cases, I don't want to be demeaning to them, but the garden variety cases are the ones that you're asking for money damages. But sometimes you have a case that has a sort of more emergent aspect to it. So for this case in particular, this is a prisoner with a lot of physical health issues for which he needs some immediate relief in terms of his housing assignment. And, he's had other problems too, so there's both aspects of that case.
Now, is that something still pending or?
That's still pending.
Okay.
Another case on behalf of protesters against pipeline development in central Pennsylvania. The pipeline goes through the whole state,
Right.
but this issue is in central Pennsylvania.
Now, I'm a naturalist, so I'm always on trail. Now you got my interest. What's going on with that pipeline case?
Yeah, this is the Mariner East 2 pipeline from Sunoco/Energy Transfer Partners. And they had organized a protest because the pipeline company had just gotten an order allowing them to clear cut trees on the easement. And you get the easement by getting the PUC, Pennsylvania Utilities Commission, to declare your pipeline a public benefit, public utility. So now you have the right of condemning private property to build your pipeline. They condemned the property. They got a judgment for the condemnation. They came in to get a judgment to clear the trees. They got the judgment. Then they staged this demonstration against it. And during the demonstration, they arrested some of the landowners and some of their supporters for doing nothing. And then came back again and did it again. And that was the civil rights aspect of it. But the case is bigger than that, in that the pipeline company, we've alleged that they've cooperated in a kind of campaign to intimidate or silence the family and their supporters. So in addition to constitutional litigation, a lot of what I do and my firm does is in certain environmental cases involving contamination, oftentimes toxic tort cases, like you might have seen that movie Aaron Brockovich, or heard of A Civil Action, which is a book and a movie. Cases like that we do a lot of. And what I find really interesting about that case is it's sort of a dovetailing of those two areas of law, which you would think would be more common, but essentially because of the late Justice Scalia, it's not. That's very hard to bring a environmental wrong as a civil rights case.
Wow. And that's also still pending, or?
That's still pending.
Yeah. And so when you said that the companies began a system of allegedly intimidating and the protesters, how so? How did they try to silence them?
Troll campaigns online.
Really?
Yeah.
So that company went all out.
All out.
And okay.
So it's surveillance and intimidation.
Tell me more about the surveillance part.
There was a person who came onto the property saying, "I want to, support you and join your movement," and then they didn't trust her. They tried to vet her, and the place she said she was from, nobody had heard of her. And then pictures popped up online, and in some of them you could actually see the zipper pocket. So clearly that they were taken from the pocket of a jacket, or maybe something else.
So they actually tried to infiltrate the movement.
They did.
Interesting.
I mean, it's central Pennsylvania, so the movement it's not
big.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's it's very rural there. I don't even think their road has a name.
Interesting. So these are things that people see and read about. They see on television, they read about in books and magazines, but they actually take place. And when they happen, people like you, attorneys like you, are called to go in and to help otherwise people who couldn't prove their innocence or be heard get heard in the right places.
That's true, and it's also important for them to know that they have the opportunity to be heard, because sometimes, just I heard what you were talking about with the judge before, why people don't come forward if they've been the victim of sexual violence. There's a similar sort of aspect to that with victims of bureaucratic violence, or police violence, or law enforcement violence, things like that. They don't think they'll be believed, and if they are afraid they'll be harassed. I've seen that a lot of times. People who are a little gun shy about the idea of litigation.
And tell me more about bureaucratic violence. We know about police violence. We know about other forms of violence perpetrated against those who either blow the whistle or somehow get the ire of the powers that be, so to speak. What forms can bureaucratic violence take?
Well, I guess I was conceiving it primarily as like police, but it could also just be jamming somebody up on this and that to make their life more difficult because they're a gadfly or something like that. And police, you also have to consider correctional officers in correctional institutions, because those acts of violence also implicate your civil rights.
And when the Pope when did the Pope come to Philly? That was 2000.
It was 2015.
And you wrote a lot of people may not know, but you're a columnist or a writer.
Well, it was just an op-ed or letter to the editor. Yeah, it's not a routine activity.
Well, it should be. What can we do to make that happen?
I don't know who to call. I wish I did.
I think I can help you with that. But you actually wrote at the time of the Pope's visit and subsequent to the Pope's visit, you wrote an article. I believe it had something to do with the effect of what he can expect to find. Because for our listeners that may not know, when the Pope came, he visited a prison, CFCF, Carolyn County Prison.
Correctional facility, yeah.
Correctional facility, yes. And you wrote a column prior to him doing so, what he can expect to find in the prisons. What could you tell me about that?
Right. So what he could have expected to find in 2015, I really can't say if that's still true of 2018. Supposedly, conditions have improved. And we know for a fact that the population has decreased.
Yes.
But at the time, we were very involved in litigation involving the conditions of confinement, mostly at CFCF, but in some of the other Philadelphia prisons. And what you had at the time was a process called triple celling, which is what it sounds like. It's when you put 3 people in a cell, but it's not a cell built for 3 people. So if you had a typical 2-person cell, you had 2 cots, 2 desks, 1 toilet. You also had what they called a boat, which was a plastic cot that got stored wherever. It's also where you would store your things in this plastic boat. People would have to sleep with their head or feet next to the toilet. There were also, quote unquote, ease the overcrowding, these like utility closets with no windows in them, no ventilation, that they would put like 2 bunk beds in. Like a glorified broom closet.
That people actually lived.
Yeah. So you obviously are, you're aware of like the general issues you have with prison populations and management of those populations. You have people with mental illnesses, people with various diseases that are exacerbated by close conditions of confinement. Certain skin infections can be made worse by those close conditions of confinement. When your facility is so overwhelmed, it's hard to be as clean as you need to be to manage infection control and things like that. And diseases and infections can spread much more easily simply by virtue of the overpopulation. And that's not even getting into the issue of the fact that there were just too many people in prison.
And subsequent to that, as mentioned, you wrote a book. You wrote an OPAD after the Pope's visit. What did you say in that OPAD? I believe it.
Well, I wrote the what the Pope can expect in prison. Then I was interviewed in the Guardian.
Mhm.
Right.
And about the crisis in U.S. prisons you mentioned, I believe. Tell me about that crisis in U.S. prisons.
Well, we were specifically talking about the overpopulation.
Okay.
And,
Gotcha.
There are much smarter people than me that could tell you much more about it. But, there's a lot of sociological, economic impact to the idea of over-incarceration. But my point was more specific on the impact of mass incarceration on the people actually inside a facility at the time. So it was a lot of the same points that I tried to make in that article, that you have an overcrowded facility, people don't get the treatment that they need, people don't have the resources that they need, and they're exposed to conditions that compromise their health, their physical and mental health.
And when it comes to prisons, well, U.S. prisons, a lot of people outside of prisons who have loved ones, and in Philadelphia, I think in Pennsylvania, the majority of prisoners come from Philadelphia. Even though there's a lot of counties, most of the prisoners, or a majority of the prisoners, come from this city. When it comes to civil rights, a lot of people feel that their loved ones in prisons, they feel helpless. What would you say to those who have loved ones in prisons? What can they do to empower themselves, or to effectively advocate for their loved ones incarcerated?
Well, I guess to an extent it depends what they're trying to accomplish. But if it's just contact, letter writing campaigns are, I understand, to be very effective and very powerful to the person behind bars, to receive that sort of contact and communication. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot that you can do, but I think that it's easy to feel powerless, and when you feel powerless, it's hard to think about, like, where can I even look to do something about this. But if you think that your loved one is being mistreated, an attorney is a good place to start. If you think it's just some unfairness in the system, I'd go to Harrisburg probably. But there's strength in numbers, and you can accomplish much more as a group than you could ever accomplish by yourself. So it's also going to be about finding people in a similar situation and taking that group to a venue where they can be heard collectively.
Can I just ask you this, because I didn't even know. So let me make sure I make it clear to everybody who probably didn't know. But what exactly is a civil rights attorney? Like, in order for me to say, hey, my civil rights may have been violated, I need to know what it is first in order for me to say that they've been violated. And then, can I just go to any lawyer to help me with civil rights? Or is there, like, I guess, like, when you're sick, you go to that specialist that just specifies in just that. So
Yeah. So I understand why it might be a little confusing, because there's civil rights, but there's also civil litigation, which is everything that's not criminal. So it's not coextensive. Civil rights is a specialty, and most lawyers these days have specialties. It doesn't have to be one thing, but I think that if you are dealing with a civil rights violation, you want somebody who is practiced in that area of law. What we mean usually by civil rights are constitutional rights. So your First Amendment right to free speech, your Fourth Amendment right not to be beat up by the police, your Eighth Amendment right to be treated decently in prison. Those are the big ones.
And I just want to note, did you see how easily he just pulled out those amendments to the Constitution?
I had the 14th, yeah, and then I just, they say if you don't use them, you lose them. So, but okay. So hey,
But I have more. Because I think that usually what we mean when we say civil rights attorney is somebody who's litigating a constitutional rights violation. But civil rights, as we use the word today, is a little more broad than that, because you have various civil rights statutes that protect your ability not to be discriminated against at work. Usually with the civil rights case, a constitutional rights case, you have a state actor as the defendant, a police officer, the, something like that. But your Title VII rights, which is employment discrimination, that's regarded as civil rights too. And I don't think it's unfair to say you're a civil rights lawyer if you do employment discrimination cases.
Okay. So.
Oh, no.
That's just an example. There's other statutes too.
Oh, I'm sure.
Sure they are. Like now, why so many breakdowns of all of these statutes? Like, what is it? Started off with just one, and someone was like, "Oh," okay. And then you implement another one, and then is that how that generally goes?
Well, this is really for civil rights in the broader sense. It's really more of a historical product. So the statute I told you about, 42 Section 1983, was part of a package of legislation called the Ku Klux Klan Act, which should have been called the Anti-Ku Klux Klan Act because that's what it was. But that was the name of the bill at the time, and that was a Reconstruction product to try to crack down on rampant white supremacy, primarily in the South, but everywhere. The other sort of civil rights packages came out of the sort of mid 20th century civil rights movement. So that's dovetails a little bit with the idea that this case in 1961 kind of opened the gates for this litigation in earnest, because you had something that looks really good on paper, but it wasn't really the experience of people being able to vindicate their constitutional rights, and now it is.
So did that answer your question?
No, that answered my question.
You know, I know a little bit about law myself. If you have any questions you want to ask me.
Well, I didn't even need to ask him.
No, of course you did.
I could have just asked
That's
you.
Mr. Markos.
And then you would have asked him.
I'll just pass you the answer.
Yeah, you just pass him. Just not at the bar, though.
Yeah, because when I go to the only bar I ever go to, I'm getting me a 45. And
I don't think that would have worked in the court of law.
Mr. Markos, we thank you. Unless Asanya have any more questions.
No. I mean, is there anything that you would like to elaborate to our audience, about the law, or about, especially your law firm?
Yeah, my law firm is called Williams Cedar, Williams Cedar, like the wood, and that's also our website, www.williamscedar.com. We primarily represent plaintiffs in various contexts, not only civil rights, not only environmental cases. We care a lot about the people we represent. We usually care a little bit about the case itself. We understand that it's important not just to have your day in court, but to be understood and to have that empathy behind you to support you.
I like the way you said that. Say that again. We understand that it's important not just to have your day in court, but what?
Just to have somebody who feels empathetic and to support you.
That's what we need. I don't care who you talk to when it comes to whether you're a defendant or whether you're a prosecution. A lot of people do not feel understood in the court system. They just feel as though they are lost, and they have people speaking for them, speaking to them, not with them.
Understanding, I'm in a rush because I have to get rid of you so I can get to my next case, and no one's paying attention to me, and
right.
And then it's bad enough I don't understand the charges. Then I don't understand like the jargon, because lawyers understand, that talk to talk. And then I'm sitting there like, what did they just say? Like, are you speaking alien or human? And then you like brush me off. I get that.
We have a tendency to speak our own language, but I think it's really important to make sure that my client understands what's happening.
Right.
Great, great. And one more time, the name of your law firm, the website address, and if listeners were interested and they wanted to maybe contact you, where can they reach you?
So Williams Cedar is the name of the firm. Williams, like the name, has an S at the end. Cedar, Cedar. That's the website, williamcedar.com. The number's 215-557-0099. My email is my first initial, last name, C. Markos, Markos, at williamcedar.com. What was your other question?
No, that was it. I was just asking
that's
if
just
people wanted
the contact information. Yeah, and I am happy to take the time to answer a question, even if it's not about a case.
Now your firm, is this like your consultation? Is there like a consultation fee?
We don't charge consultation fees, no. And cases like this, we take on contingent basis usually. Our agreement always depends on the facts of the case, so there's no boilerplate rule. But the interesting thing about a lot of these civil rights cases is, I think most people are familiar with attorneys charging contingent fees, but these civil rights cases have statutes where if you win, you can make the defendant pay the attorney's fees.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. And the idea behind that is to encourage attorneys to take cases that may not be worth a whole lot because they shut me up at the town meeting, kind of thing. May not be worth a whole lot, but your constitutional right still means something. And in order to vindicate a case like that might not ever be taken on a contingent basis, these statutes encourage attorneys to step up.
Great.
Okay.
Lasagna?
Okay. Well, is that it?
I'm impressed. I learned a few things. I got a page full of notes on my little tablet here, and I really appreciate you for stopping in.
Well, I really appreciate you asking me to be here.
Yes.
Thank you.
Considering, I really didn't think this was going to go. Like I didn't cancel, reschedule, and put it off. And
I had a feeling it was going to work out.
And 3 weeks later, he's here. Like,
Yay! So we thank you and appreciate it, and you have to come back again sometime and keep us up to date on some of those cases you're working on.
We just can't name drop.
We just can't name drop.
I try not to.
Yeah.
But
We go around there hypothetical because you don't want people to that sounds like my case. Did he just discuss my case? And so we don't want that one. But I appreciate you coming out here and hanging out with my new co-host that I have. I snagged him for a little bit.
how'd I do? I did okay?
Yeah.
Mr. Markos, how'd I do?
You get 2 pieces of candy.
Best co-host I've ever had.
Thank you.
But before we go, Mr. Markos, I always ask our guests to leave our audience with something positive to rest their head on. So I ask you to leave our audience with something they can, rest assured on.
Yeah. Like I was saying before, it's easy to feel powerless, and when you feel powerless, it's easy to feel lost. But there is a lot of power in collective action. There's people who can support you through your struggle, and you're feeling like I'm the victim and nobody else cares about me. If you get involved with a group of people, if you can turn your struggle into a movement, there's a lot more power in that. It's the difference between one bad cop and one bad culture, and the sort of collectivized response to that makes all the difference. So I would encourage people not to lose hope and to find some support.
Or as we say in the hood, group up. Group up. Oh, maybe I just made that up.
Yeah, you just made that up.
Well, I walked away from a few things from this interview. I tell you, I'm feeling empowered and enlightened. Thanks again.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I appreciate everyone for sticking around. And first we had the judge, we have the lawyer, and to give us a few, we're going to come back with my returning guest. We're still going to wrap up and discuss mental health. So Shara Ruffin will be here and giving us her input and views on mental health and what it is to suffer from it and all that other good stuff. Actually, it's, well, yeah. But stay tuned because we have more